In this episode, we move from individual controls to the larger question of how a secure environment should be designed so that one weakness does not become a total failure. New learners often picture security as a collection of separate tools, rules, and settings, but architecture is really about how those choices fit together across the whole environment. That is where defense in depth and zero trust becomes so important, because both ideas help explain how strong security is built into the shape of the system instead of being added as a thin outer shell. Defense in depth teaches that no single control should carry the entire burden of protection. Zero trust teaches that access should not be assumed safe simply because it comes from inside a familiar network or from a user who passed one earlier check. When those two ideas are layered into architecture, the environment becomes harder to misuse, harder to move through carelessly, and much easier to reason about when something goes wrong. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is part of our companion study series. The first book is a detailed study guide that explains the exam and helps you prepare for it with confidence. The second is a Kindle-only ebook with 1,000 flashcards you can use on your mobile device or Kindle for quick review. You can find both at Cyber.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is understanding what architecture means in security. It is not just a diagram of servers, cloud services, user devices, and network lines. It is the way trust, access, visibility, and control are arranged so that systems can support the business without creating unnecessary exposure. When security is treated as something that happens only at the edge, the design often assumes that anything inside the boundary is mostly safe. That assumption becomes dangerous very quickly in modern environments where users work remotely, applications live in multiple places, and attackers often gain access through stolen credentials, phishing, weak integrations, or compromised devices rather than by simply smashing through one obvious wall. Defense in depth answers that problem by saying protection should exist in multiple places at once. If one layer fails, another layer should still slow the problem down, reduce the damage, or reveal that something abnormal is happening before the issue spreads too far. Defense in depth is sometimes misunderstood as a vague idea that more controls are always better, but that is too simplistic. The real idea is not to pile on random security measures until the environment becomes confusing or hard to use. The real idea is to create meaningful layers that address different parts of the risk picture so that trust is not concentrated in one fragile decision point. A password alone should not be the only thing standing between an attacker and sensitive data. A network boundary alone should not be the only thing stopping movement into critical systems. A user device being on the right office floor should not be the only reason it receives broad internal access. Each layer should contribute something different, such as stronger identity checks, segmentation, device validation, application controls, logging, or data protection. When those layers work together, security becomes more resilient because failure in one place does not automatically grant wide and silent success everywhere else. A simple way to picture defense in depth is to imagine a well-protected building rather than a single locked door. There may be exterior lighting, controlled entrances, visitor check-in, badge access, security cameras, restricted floors, locked rooms, and safes inside those rooms. None of those measures is perfect by itself, but together they reduce the chance that one mistake or one bypass gives an intruder total freedom. Digital environments work the same way. The safest design does not depend on one hero control doing everything. It depends on several thoughtfully placed controls that each narrow opportunity create friction for misuse and help contain the blast radius of a bad event. This also means layers should be tied to the value and sensitivity of what they protect. A public brochure website does not need the same architecture as payroll systems, design secrets, industrial control environments, or identity infrastructure. Good architecture uses layered protection in proportion to business risk rather than spreading every control everywhere without purpose. Zero trust enters the picture by challenging a very old and very risky habit in security thinking, which is the habit of trusting something too broadly just because it appears to be inside, familiar, or previously approved. Zero trust does not mean trusting nothing in a dramatic or impossible sense. It means avoiding automatic trust based on weak assumptions such as location on the internal network possession of a device that connected successfully yesterday, or membership in a group that has never been reviewed closely. Instead, access decisions should be based on verified identity, current context, device condition, least privilege, and the actual resource being requested. This changes architecture because trust is no longer granted once and then carried everywhere without question. The environment begins to ask more precise questions about who is requesting access, what they are requesting, from what kind of device, for what business purpose, and whether that access should continue only for a narrow scope rather than for everything nearby. These two ideas are closely related, but they are not identical, and understanding that difference helps beginners a great deal. Defense in depth is about having multiple protective layers so that risk is distributed and failure is contained. Zero trust is about reducing broad assumptions of trust and making access decisions more specific, more verified, and more limited to actual need. Defense in depth could exist in an environment that still trusts its internal network too much. Zero trust could be applied in ways that strengthen identity and access decisions even if other layers remain weak. The strongest architectural approach usually combines them. Defense in depth provides the layered structure, while zero trust sharpens the logic behind how those layers decide what should be trusted at each step. Together, they move the environment away from one large trusted interior and toward a design where every meaningful access path is narrower, more deliberate, and less likely to grant wide freedom just because the first gate happened to open. Identity becomes one of the most important architectural layers once this way of thinking takes hold. If the environment no longer assumes that internal presence is enough, then the identity making the request matters even more. That means authentication should be stronger than a single weak password, and authorization should be based on least privilege rather than convenience or historical accumulation. Identity and access management, IAM, plays a central role here because architecture must account for who can reach what, under which conditions, and how that access changes over time. A user who works in finance should not quietly inherit the ability to reach engineering data, administrative systems, and sensitive support tools just because the identity passed one earlier login check. In a layered design, identity is not just the front door. It is a continuing decision factor that helps shape access at the application, data, and service level. That approach reduces the value of stolen credentials and makes access much more tightly connected to present business need. Device trust is another major layer because a valid user identity does not automatically mean the device being used is equally trustworthy. A managed corporate laptop with current protections, expected configuration, and known ownership creates a different risk picture than an unknown device, an outdated personal tablet, or a system that may already be compromised. Zero trust thinking encourages the architecture to consider device condition as part of access decisions rather than assuming that any device connected through a familiar path deserves the same treatment. Defense in depth strengthens this by ensuring that even if a questionable device manages to authenticate successfully, it still encounters additional boundaries before reaching sensitive resources. This may mean reduced access, stronger monitoring, narrower application paths, or different treatment for higher-risk requests. The big lesson for beginners is that users and devices are not the same thing. A trusted employee using an untrusted or unhealthy device should not necessarily receive the same reach as that same employee using a well-managed device in a known and controlled context. Network design also changes when these ideas are taken seriously. In older models, the network edge often received most of the attention, while the interior remained comparatively open. Once something got inside, movement could be broad because the architecture assumed that internal traffic was largely safe. Defense in depth and zero trust both challenge that assumption. Instead of one large trusted interior, the network is divided into more meaningful trust areas with segmentation, controlled paths, and tighter visibility over how systems communicate. This is important because many incidents spread through lateral movement after the first foothold has already been gained. If the architecture includes internal boundaries, then a compromised workstation does not automatically gain direct access to every server, database, administrative interface, or management network. Those internal control points create more places where abnormal movement can be slowed, denied, or detected. The environment becomes safer not because nothing is allowed to communicate, but because communication is restricted to the relationships that genuinely support the business. Applications also need to be treated as architectural control points rather than simply as destinations behind a firewall. A modern environment may have users connecting from different locations, through different devices, and into services that live partly on-site and partly in cloud platforms. That makes application layer control much more important because the application often knows more about the user, the requested function, and the data involved than the broader network does. A layered design uses that advantage by keeping application permissions narrow, by separating user roles carefully, and by avoiding the assumption that once a user reaches the application, everything inside it should be equally available. Zero Trust pushes the application to make finer-grained decisions about what specific actions are justified. Defense in depth ensures that if an application control is misused or bypassed, additional protections such as logging, data restrictions, or segmented backend systems still reduce the overall damage. The goal is to make the application itself part of security architecture instead of treating it as something the network alone must protect from a distance. Data deserves its own place in the architecture because ultimately many security decisions matter most for what they protect, not merely for what they connect. If the design focuses only on networks and identities, it may miss the fact that sensitive data can still be copied, exposed, or mishandled by users and processes that have broader access than necessary. A layered approach protects data through classification, handling rules, role-based visibility, and limits on how far information can travel or be transformed without proper reason. Zero Trust strengthens this by asking whether the person, process, or service requesting the data truly needs that specific information under the current conditions. Defense in depth helps by ensuring that even if one control fails, the data is not instantly free of all restraint. A file server, a database, a collaboration platform, and an analytics environment may all need different levels of protection depending on what they hold. When architecture becomes data-aware, security shifts from protecting locations alone to protecting the value that actually matters to the organization. Monitoring and response are also essential layers, even though beginners sometimes think of them as separate from architecture. In reality, architecture without visibility is fragile because the organization cannot tell whether its layers are working as intended or whether abnormal behavior is already moving through the environment. Defense in depth assumes that some controls will eventually fail or be bypassed, which means detection becomes part of resilience rather than a sign of failure. Zero Trust supports this by encouraging closer attention to unusual access patterns, repeated requests, unexpected device behavior, and attempts to use identities or services in ways that do not fit normal need. Logging, alerting, and investigation pathways help turn architecture into something observable rather than something merely hoped for. This matters because a good layered design does not only block risk. It also makes suspicious behavior easier to notice and contain. The sooner a compromised device, abused identity, or unusual data access pattern is recognized, the more likely the organization can limit damage before the issue becomes widespread. A practical example helps connect all of this. Imagine an employee working from home on a managed laptop and trying to access a sensitive financial application. In a weak design, the user logs in once, connects through a remote path, and then receives broad access because the system assumes that passing the first check means everything else is fine. In a layered zero trust design, the architecture looks more carefully at the identity, the device condition, the requested application, and the level of sensitivity involved. The user may be allowed into the application, but only with role-based access that limits what records can be viewed or changed. The network may allow only the specific path needed rather than broad internal visibility. The application may log unusual actions, and the data itself may have handling restrictions that reduce inappropriate export or reuse. If the laptop is later compromised, the attacker faces multiple controls instead of one collapsed perimeter. That example shows how defense in depth and zero trust become real architectural behavior rather than abstract security slogans. Several misconceptions tend to get in the way unless they are addressed early. One is the idea that zero trust means people are never trusted at all, when the better explanation is that trust should be earned in context and limited to actual need rather than assumed too broadly. Another is the belief that defense in depth means buying many products, when the deeper point is designing complementary controls that address different failure paths. Some learners also assume these ideas only matter in very large organizations with huge budgets, but even smaller environments benefit from layered identity checks, sensible segmentation, careful application access, and stronger treatment of sensitive data. A further misconception is that strong architecture must always make work slow and painful. Poorly designed security certainly can do that, but thoughtful architecture often improves clarity by making trust decisions more consistent, more defensible, and more closely aligned to real roles and resources. The goal is not endless friction. The goal is reducing broad, unnecessary exposure while still supporting legitimate work. By the end of this discussion, the core message should feel clear and practical. Defense in depth teaches that no one control should stand alone, so architecture should include several meaningful layers that reduce risk in different ways and contain failure when it happens. Zero Trust teaches that access should not be granted broadly just because something feels internal, familiar, or previously approved, so architecture should verify more carefully and limit trust to what is currently justified. When these ideas are layered together, identity becomes stronger, devices are treated more realistically, networks are segmented more thoughtfully, applications make narrower decisions, data is protected closer to where it lives, and monitoring helps reveal when something no longer fits expected behavior. That is what it means to layer defense in depth and zero trust into architecture. It means designing environments where trust is deliberate, exposure is reduced, and one broken piece does not quietly become a broken everything.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.